Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, sitting in for Riz Khan. At a high-level United Nations summit in New York, world leaders laid out elaborate plans to tackle global poverty and hunger. But can they really make a difference? Those attending the summit on Millennium Development Goals pledged to achieve 8 goals by 2015. Those objectives also include fighting major diseases, promoting gender equality and reducing child mortality. US President Barack Obama announced a change in policy, saying instead of simply handing out aid, his administration would reward poorer nations for economic growth.
Consider the millions of people who have relied on food assistance for decades. That's not development, that's dependence, and it's a cycle we need to break. Instead of just managing poverty, we have to offer nations and peoples a path out of poverty.
Today we ask, are the Millennium Development Goals a pragmatic approach to some of the world's most critical problems, or are they simply a set of unachievable benchmarks? Remember, you can call in with your questions and comments. You can also send us an SMS or email. Joining me now from New York is Dr. John MacArthur, Chief Executive Officer of Millennium Promise. It's an international non-profit organization dedicated to cutting extreme poverty by half in the next 5 years. And here with me in the studio, I have Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter, the U.S. State Department's Director of Policy Planning, who advises U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Welcome to both of you to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Slaughter, let me start with you. The United States has a lot on its plate right now. You've engaged in 2 wars. There's the Middle East talks, there's China, and a host of other things. So when one looks at efforts to alleviate poverty, hunger, improve health conditions in developing countries, where does that fit in the U.S. pecking order?
I think one of the most important dimensions of this new policy is actually the recognition that it fits at the very top, that actually development issues are inextricably connected to all those other problems. So if you talk about Iraq, it's evident that development in Iraq is critical to a stable democracy there. In Afghanistan, the military themselves say that development and governance is as important as what happens on the military side. And then if we look at broader issues like global health issues, climate change, the global economy, growing economies, development for billions of people in the world is central. So this administration doesn't distinguish between traditional foreign policy and development. It says development is a core part of our foreign policy.
So you're not separating the issues, it's all integrated. Now, there's been talk of something called the 3 Ds.
Yes.
Diplomacy, defense, and development.
Yes.
Is that the structure within which this exists?
That is, exactly. And when Secretary Clinton was first appointed, she talked about smart power and bringing different kinds of power together. And the 3 Ds, as you say, are defense and diplomacy and development. And to think of those together, again, in a specific country like Afghanistan, or in a region, parts of Africa or parts of Latin America, to be thinking together in terms of how we can use our diplomatic power to push development issues. So you hear Secretary Clinton talks about Middle East peace, but she also talks about cook stoves and maternal mortality and food security. Those are critical issues. So we use our diplomatic platform to advance development. And then, of course, our development arm is actively working on the ground with our diplomats and sometimes with our soldiers.
Okay, let's go to Dr. John MacArthur. He's in New York. Dr. MacArthur, the United Nations has just held a conference, a very high-level conference, looking at where we are as far as the Millennium Development Goals are concerned. If you could get one headline out of that conference, what would it be?
Well, I think the biggest one is that the world is still so focused on the goals, and it's a bit of a miracle in many ways that at such a time of global turbulence, extraordinary economic strain over the past couple of years around the world, 10 years after the largest ever gathering of world leaders came together in 2000 to set these goals for 2015, we had more than 140 world leaders come together last week to talk about what needs to be done to get the job finished. So the fact that we're able even to have this very serious, systematic conversation about where there's progress, where there are gaps, is a testament to the success of the Millennium Goals. Of course, the goals are just goals. They're not results unto themselves. And we've seen many areas of breakthrough in the past 10 years. So we've seen breakthroughs, especially in global health. We've started to see the seeds of breakthrough in agriculture. The U.S. Feed the Future initiative is a major piece of that. But there is a lot to be done still. There's a lot of practical programs that are unfunded. There's major resource constraints that are holding back a lot of the development priorities, and there really is a serious need for action and implementation in the next 5 years.
When you say there's a lot to be done and there are, as you put it, resource restraints, are you talking about money here?
Absolutely. You know, this isn't ever a problem only about money, but in many instances it's ultimately about money. There are huge gaps, for example, at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, malaria, which has been pioneering the efforts along with the U.S. Presidential initiatives for AIDS and malaria to really scale up the basic health systems, the maternal health announcements that came out last week. These things ultimately need money to pay for the nurses, the community health workers, the medicines, the bed nets, and so forth. And we're at a time where 5 years ago, the G8, the group of 8 richest countries in the world, made major commitments for 2010 for this year in terms of increasing their development support. They're actually about $20 billion behind, which is trivial in modern macroeconomic terms, but is pretty serious when measured by bed nets, nurses, community health workers, bags of fertilizer, and so forth. And so these resources really do matter, and we're at a time where many of the rich countries are cutting back, unfortunately. Many are holding their ground, and a few, like the United Kingdom, are really kind of holding the course with major increases that have been promised and are being maintained.
Okay. Dr. Slaughter, you talked about this different approach that the United States is now taking. That's going to call for a change in the structure of, say, USAID, isn't it?
It's called for rebuilding USAID. USAID.
That's your main agency that deals
yes,
with
that is the
development.
Agency for International Development, and it has lost a great many people over the past decades. It was created by John F. Kennedy exactly as a core part of our foreign policy, and it had years and decades where it contributed hugely to the Green Revolution, to really major advances. But it needs rebuilding, and we have a dynamic new administrator, Dr. Rajiv Shah, who is putting all sorts of changes into place, and we're hiring up to 1,000 new foreign service officers. But we're also doing things a little differently. John talked about money, and obviously money is important, but there's a lot of money that is not being spent well, and a large part of what the president was talking about is a focus on economic growth and governance, is a focus on making sure that money goes to sustainable economic engines so that countries can then grow themselves. Assistance is important, but it cannot be the engine that actually lifts countries out of poverty. And the governance part is to make sure that money actually gets to the people it's supposed to serve. Obviously, transparency, payment systems, fighting corruption, that's a key part of this approach.
Well, let me ask you about how that works in a very practical way.
Yes.
There's an example cited here by Oxfam, which is a major NGO. It cites the example of a school in rural sub-Saharan Africa. Money is allocated for the construction of a school, perhaps in a village, perhaps in a town in sub-Saharan Africa. The school is built, but there are no teachers, there are no textbooks. Yes. So the school is never used. Under the new policy, how would that change?
It's a great question, and it's exactly the kind of problem we're trying to solve. One of the reasons you get that situation is that a particular nation wants to focus on education in its development for domestic reasons, for whatever reasons, so it goes and builds schools. But it hasn't coordinated with the government itself. So how it would change is we would not build a school unless the government in that country had building schools as a core part of its development plan. So it has to start with the government's own plan, and of course if the government's going to build schools, then the government has to also provide the teachers, and we will help provide those teachers, we'll help train them. But we have to be reinforcing what the government wants to do, rather than our doing things and then hoping that other donors or that the government will come in and help that be sustainable.
So it's more of a bottom-up approach, is it?
It's a partnership approach,
Yeah.
because obviously we don't just have say to the government, come in with your plans and we'll fund them. It's a very interactive development process where the country says we want to focus on food or on agriculture, on education, or on health, and we and other donors, both NGOs and also other governments like the British or international agencies, work together.
Okay, Dr. MacArthur, I want to look at some of the targets set within the Millennium Development Goals. And I'm looking here as a graph that we've built, a graphic rather. In sub-Saharan Africa, 58% were making below $1.25 a day in 1990. That number dropped by only 7% by 2005. Now that is well short of the target set by the MDG. Now in contrast, let's look at Asia. Extreme poverty in Eastern Asia fell from 60% in 1990 to 16% in 2005. And that exceeded the Millennium Development Goals comfortably. So here's the question. What's working in Eastern Asia that isn't working in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I think it goes back to some of the points that Dr. Slaughter was making around the Green Revolution in particular, which is about the first steps of boosting agricultural production and food production in places where the majority of the population is farmers or are farmers. If you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, the biggest question around economic growth is where will the growth actually come from? We've seen an uptick in growth, a significant uptick since 2000. Many countries growing pretty reliably even through the strains of the past couple of years. And where we've seen the greatest growth successes, it's in the places where the farmers have been able to get access to fertilizer and modern seeds to literally double and triple their crops. Because when you're a farmer and you grow food for a living, your economy is food and is growing more and better crops. We saw Malawi, for example, a country that put in place a national agricultural input support program, basically helping every farmer get a bag of fertilizer and a can of seeds. In 2008, when the world was going through its meta-crisis economically, the country grew at 9%. That type of growth has its own roots, and we need to understand why the President Obama and Secretary Clinton and the leadership of State Department has been so crucial, along with, of course, Dr. Shah, to get agriculture back at the front of the global agenda. This was overlooked for basically a generation internationally, and we're now seeing that this can provide the next, I would say, wave of breakthrough economic growth, especially in Africa, where it's been ultimately a pretty stagnant rural economy. And if we see that breakthrough with the support for the agriculture, which again has a resource constraint because the farmers can't afford the fertilizer without help, if they can get the support for the fertilizer, the basic inputs, then we should be able to see very quick takeoffs across the continent, but actually for very small amounts of targeted investment.
Okay, we'll get back to that point in a moment, but right now we're going to take a short break. When we come back, with donor fatigue setting in after the Haiti earthquake and Pakistan floods, could financial support for the Millennium Development Goals dry up? We'll have more of that in our discussion in just a few moments. Stay with us. Welcome back. Global leaders at the United Nations last week promised to lift hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty by 2015. But can they raise the billions of dollars required, and is that goal even realistic? Discussing those issues with me are Dr. John MacArthur, Chief Executive Officer of Millennium Promise, an international non-profit organization committed to eradicating extreme poverty, and the U.S. State Department's Director of Policy Planning, Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter. Let's get back to the questions. And I just want to get back to the issue we were talking about just before the break, and that was the great progress that has been made in Eastern Asia in achieving these Millennium Development Goals, especially in the agricultural sector. You were saying to me that to a large extent that's due to the fact that many of the farmers are female.
Well, the 70% of the world's smallholder farmers are women. So when we're now trying to build agriculture in Africa, which is absolutely the key, as John said, to the kind of growth we saw in Asia, you can't just think about farmers. You have to think about women farmers and what they need particularly, and you have to think about how you get from farm to market and how you build nutrition, and it's an interconnected system. But a lot of it does start with the empowerment and education of women.
Dr. MacArthur, I want to get back to the funding gap that we talked about a little earlier. Is there a danger of donor fatigue, especially when we look at some very big disasters that have happened in the past few months?
Well, I think there's always a risk of people getting tired and very much people getting confused about where things are working and where they're not. And also, of course, where there's emergencies of the humanitarian crisis variety compared to those that are the long-term, quieter emergencies that are often just as big or much greater in scale. We have to make sure that we're taking a very long-term view to tackling some of the challenges that were coming up earlier, like the teachers, like the community health workers, the staff that need to be trained. That doesn't happen 1 year at a time. That happens over a really medium term, maybe 5-year, 10-year, 20-year time horizon. And the developing countries, if they really want to feel our support, they need to know that we're there for the medium and long term to work with them. That's why these targets for 2015, that's why holding the financial commitments are also important. I think when we look at the rich country gaps, we really have to be actually quite segmented and go country by country. As I mentioned, the UK has actually set its timetable to achieve the international target, which was again reconfirmed last week, of 0.7%, 0.7% of national income for development assistance to reach that before 2015. They're consolidating their entire government budget, but they decided that they won't do so on the backs of the world's poorest people. They're going to hold that timetable. That's a major breakthrough for the world, and there are several countries that are actually holding that course. We have other countries like Italy, France, Germany, that are actually falling quite far behind on what they've committed to do. And that's a major problem because many of the finance ministers in the poorest countries feel like they can't know what to plan for because these commitments end up so often being only words. In the middle, in the sense, you have countries like the United States, like Canada, that have made much more modest commitments quantitatively. So the US, for example, is holding steady at about 0.2%, 1/5 of 1% of national income for global development support, but has maintained its commitments. So it's made a more modest commitment. It's the biggest donor, so everything it does makes a huge impact around the world. The major commitments for health have been really leading the way and scaling up support in Africa. But it's still, nowhere near the global standard that has been constantly reaffirmed of 0.7, and that's one of the major bottlenecks to the goals.
Okay, Dr. Slaughter, I suppose that does call into question national priorities as well. We have an email that came in on that issue in a sense. It was from Bamini Saidu, who sent us in this email, and she says, there is no real intention behind the Millennium Development Goals. The leaders promised to eradicate poverty, HIV and other crises, yet spend more money on war.
Well, there's no question that the military budget, the defense budget, dwarfs the development budget. And indeed, Secretary Gates, our defense secretary, has been very out front about that. He has said that we need to be demilitarizing foreign policy, that we need to be leading with civilian power, that obviously our soldiers are very important, but it is much more effective to send civilians into the world as development workers and prevent conflict and address problems at their source than it is to let those conflicts fester, erupt, and then end up having to use military power. So part of this entire policy is leading through civilian power, and that's diplomacy and development.
But there is still only a fraction of what is spent on development aid to what is spent on defense.
It is, and we are fighting a war, and we've just come out of a war, and these changes don't happen overnight. But there is absolutely a recognition that it is more cost effective to invest in development and in diplomacy, and those shifts are part of what we expect to see.
Okay, I want to get a call in very quickly. This is Vibat calling from Canada. Vibat, go ahead with your question.
My concern is that only white people are talking about poverty. We in Canada have natives who are very poor and they need development. I haven't seen a native face talking from his point of view. I've seen also people talking about Africa. They haven't been to Africa, or they've just been to they're not Africans. Those are the people at the grassroots who need to speak for themselves what they want.
Okay, thank you, Vibat. Thanks for that question. Let me put that to Dr. MacArthur. And that, of course, raises the question of helping people with development within countries that are already developed or considered developed.
Well, I think as a Canadian myself, I find obviously the questions of great interest, the challenges of poverty in Canada and in all the rich countries. I think there are two core points that the caller made. One is that, of course, we have to be thinking about poverty in all areas of the world, but we do also have to understand the relative nature of poverty. So if you look at Aboriginal communities, First Nations communities in Canada, for example, their child mortality rate, the proportion of children who don't make it to their 5th birthday, is maybe 25 out of every 1,000 children born. In the poorest parts of the low-income countries around the world, it might be 150 to 200 out of every 1,000 children don't make it to their 5th birthday. It's actually a different type of poverty and a different challenge. Doesn't minimize the one that's domestic, but it is a different type of challenge when a child dies literally because they get bit by a mosquito. But as we think about those lowest income countries, we have to really be understanding also this core point of partnership, which I think Dr. Slaughter made very clearly and we all want to see. This isn't about us sitting in North America, calling the shots, far from it. It's really about empowering the low-income countries to put in place their own strategies, which they've often already developed. And there are many heroes around Africa, around Asia, Latin America, who have done so with great success. And I think we have to understand the greatest successes of the past decade since the goals were set were overwhelmingly where national leaders, community leaders, and so forth have been empowered to implement known technologies like antiretroviral medicines to fight AIDS, like long-lasting bed nets to fight malaria. And they've done so in instances where the international community organized itself through a pretty technically sound process like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria, to enable those national strategies to get off the ground. And I would just want to come back for a moment to this question on the dollars. The point of defense budgets versus development budgets, I think we're seeing more and more recognition of investing in development is also investing in stability. In the United States, the Defense Department budget is on the order of $700 billion. In development budget, it's on the order of $30 billion. Right now, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria
I'm afraid,
is looking
Dr.
for
MacArthur,
one.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We've run out of time. You get the last word. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter for joining us as well. And thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the show and post your questions and comments. On the next show, futile negotiations. Sudan's government and Darfur's rebel liberty and justice movement have agreed to resume peace talks in Doha, Qatar. But with 2 main rebel groups not attending, can there be a resolution? Make sure you tune in for that. See you next time.